There is a photograph in the archives of the Wellcome Collection in London, a family of five, a mother, a father, two young boys, and a girl of perhaps 7 years old. They are dressed formally, and the girl at the center, the one with the slightly too wide eyes, the too perfect posture, had been dead for approximately 2 days when this was taken, and no one in that family considered this unusual. This image lives in an archive, quietly held, quietly uncatalogued by most accounts, one of thousands like it, stored in the collections of museums and universities across Europe and North America. We live in an era that quarantines death. We have built elaborate systems to ensure the dead remain largely invisible to the living. But for most of human history, the dead were not hidden. They were present. They were tended to. They were, in the most literal sense, kept close. For roughly 70 years in the 19th and early 20th centuries, spanning the early daguerreotype era through the rise of cabinet cards, the dead were photographed. This practice is called post-mortem photography, and while it is documented and acknowledged, it remains one of those aspects of the recent past that modern culture has largely chosen not to examine too carefully. The 19th century was an era of staggering child mortality. In industrial cities like London and Manchester, it was not uncommon for families to lose 2, 3, sometimes 4 children before any of them reached the age of 10. Typhoid, scarlet fever, diphtheria, cholera, diseases that have been largely erased from the modern experience of childhood, moved through Victorian communities with a frequency that is genuinely difficult to comprehend. This was not an improvised response to tragedy. It was a formal, considered, and culturally embedded ritual. There were specialized stands, some still preserved in museum collections, designed to support a deceased adult or child in an upright position while the photograph was taken. A whole vocabulary of professional craft built around photographing the dead. In the earliest post-mortem photographs, the dead are almost always shown lying down, arranged in beds or on couches, hands folded, eyes closed. But somewhere around the 1860s, the conventions begin to shift. The dead begin to sit up. They begin to appear alongside the living, propped into family groupings, placed between siblings. In 1869, the photographer Henry Peach Robinson published a manual called Pictorial Effect in Photography. In it, he addresses the photographing of the dead with a matter-of-factness that is itself remarkable. He discusses lighting, he discusses posture, he discusses how to handle what he calls the unfortunate stiffness of certain subjects, and how the skilled photographer can work around it. Robinson was not writing for specialists in mortuary work. He was writing for general photographers, for people whose studios lined the high streets of Victorian towns and cities. The casualness of his treatment tells you something significant. By 1869, the question of whether to photograph the dead was not a question at all. It was simply a service that photographers were expected to be prepared to offer. Post-mortem photography was not only practiced by the bereaved poor, it was practiced at every level of Victorian society. Queen Victoria herself, who lost her husband Prince Albert in 1861, kept a cast of his hand and a photograph of him in death among her most cherished possessions for the remaining 40 years of her life. There is a particular category of image historians call the hidden mother portrait. Infants do not hold still, so photographers developed the practice of concealing the mother, draping her in cloth, having her sit behind a chair, covering her face while her arms remained visible, cradling the infant. These images are genuinely uncanny. They show a baby apparently supported by a dark shape, or by a pair of disembodied arms, or by something that your eye reads first as a piece of furniture. Some researchers have pointed out that the hidden mother convention creates an additional wrinkle when you consider that many of these infants were already dead when the photograph was taken. The living mother holding the dead child she cannot show herself holding. The warmth of her arms present in the image, but invisible. There is something in that image that exceeds documentation. It was not uncommon for a family to lose several children before any of them reached adulthood. The particular grief of losing a child for whom no living photograph existed, because it had simply not occurred to anyone that they would need one, was a grief that many Victorian families knew intimately. The Victorian relationship with death was deeply performative, and that word should be understood in its older, more neutral sense. Death had a grammar. It had a choreography. Widows wore black for 2 years. Mourning jewelry was fashioned from jet and from the hair of the deceased. Memorial cards were printed and distributed. The rituals were elaborate, codified, and public. Within this grammar, the post-mortem photograph held a specific and recognized place. And what is perhaps less often discussed is the degree to which these photographs were displayed, not archived. Researchers have found accounts of post-mortem photographs kept not in boxes under beds, but in parlors, on mantelpieces, alongside the photographs of the living. Photography was advertised not just as a medium for the living. Studios offered memorial photography as a standard service, alongside portraits, christenings, weddings. It was listed on the signs outside their doors. There is a collector in the United States who has spent decades acquiring post-mortem photographs from estate sales and antique markets. He has hundreds of them. In interviews, he has described the experience of encountering one, of knowing, before he can fully articulate why, that what he is looking at is not quite the same as the other photographs in the box. Images that professional historians look at and say, probably, that they say, the evidence suggests, that they say, we cannot be certain, but the posture and the context and the period are all consistent with, we cannot be certain. And there is something in that uncertainty that matters. Museums quietly hold thousands of examples in their archives. Enormous collections, carefully preserved, rarely exhibited. The scale of this practice, how widespread, how ordinary it was, tends to surprise people when they first encounter it. The thing which most consistently distinguishes these images, he says, is not the visible signs, not the slightly unnatural posture, not the absence of catchlight in the eyes. What distinguishes them is a quality of attention, the way that everyone in the photograph appears to be arranging themselves around something, orienting toward a presence that is also, somehow, an absence. There was a cultural shift, part of a larger movement historians of medicine sometimes call the medicalization of death, in which the dying body was increasingly relocated to professional and institutional settings, and the management of the dead was increasingly removed from families and placed in the hands of specialists. The dead were moved out of the parlor, and the photographs moved with them, first into boxes, then into attics, then into archives. Some were thrown away, some were found decades later at estate sales, unidentified. The families who had made them long gone, the dead in the photographs now doubly anonymous. Undertakers, hospitals, funeral homes, the rituals of death moved from the domestic to the professional, from the private to the institutional, and something was lost in that transfer, something that is difficult to name but present in the difference between the two worlds. The photographs that remain are orphaned objects now, found at estate sales, at antique markets, at the bottom of boxes that nobody claimed. One face catching the light with eerie clarity, a stranger's stillness in a stranger's hands. First into boxes, then into attics, then into the long sleep of forgetting until someone opens a trunk and finds a face looking back at them through cracked glass and does not know who it is or what they are looking at. The equipment still exists: rusted iron braces, hidden support stands, leather straps, preserved now in museum collections behind glass, labeled with handwritten notes, objects designed to hold the dead upright, objects that performed a function we no longer have a word for. Imagine the room, the family gathered, the child arranged, the photographer hidden beneath a dark cloth behind the camera, the exposure timer in hand, the atmosphere solemn and procedural, not theatrical, not dramatic, simply necessary. In the earliest images, the dead are shown simply, laid on couches, on beds, on surfaces prepared for them. Hands folded, eyes closed. The composition is elegiac. It looks like what it is. There is no attempt to hide it, no attempt to fold the dead back into the world of the living. The Victorians placed death in the parlor. They looked at it, they arranged it, they photographed it, and then they put it on the mantelpiece next to the photographs of the living, and went on with their lives. What they understood, what they built into the grammar of their mourning, was that the line between the present and the absent is not as fixed as we are accustomed to treating it. The girl in the center of the photograph, the one with the slightly too wide eyes, she is still there. She has always been there. We just stopped knowing how to look.